don't all religions lead to God? This is a very common question. And let me just begin just by asking today, how many of us in this room have ever heard the term religious pluralism before this evening? How many have heard that term? See, most of our hands going up. It's really quite a well-known term, religious pluralism. The interesting thing about it is, even if you haven't heard the term, I'll bet you've heard statements like this, and maybe made them, because we don't know where everybody in this room is at. How can you say Jesus can be the only way to come to God? Anybody ever heard that kind of statement? Well, that's not a bad question in a day like ours, and it's a fairly common question. And the questions kind of go on. Isn't that arrogant to make a statement like that? Isn't that just intolerant? Isn't that exclusivistic? None of these words are complimentary, by the way. Okay, we don't compliment people by saying, he's so exclusivistic. I love that about him. That's not the kind of thing we say. And it kind of goes like this. Who are you to claim you have a monopoly on truth and say people of other faiths are not finding God and spirituality in their own way? This seems like a really arrogant statement to make in our culture today. And it's what I call the challenge or the reality of religious pluralism. And maybe in this room, we've asked that question ourselves. Maybe we're at that point now. I would say this. If you've asked that question, there's certainly no shame at admitting it. In fact, I would even say it's probably dangerous to our spiritual health not to admit. These are questions I have too. And I need to explore these questions. And I would just say this. The challenge of religious pluralism is upon us today in our culture in full force and in a very real sense, given the way our society has changed in the last 50 years. I think it would be very odd if it were not, because we've become a very multicultural society. Is that not true? I mean, we really are. Walk down the streets of Vancouver or Victoria or many other cities in our country, and you may as well be walking down the halls of the United Nations. There are so many nationalities all around us. In our neighborhood that we live in right now, it's very much like when we lived in we've been in two neighborhoods in Abbotsford in our time living there. And the one we were in, which is very much like the one we are in right now, on one side we had neighbors from Vietnam. They were boat people they came across. On the other side of us, the neighbors were from India. Across the street, they were from China. And these ones are from India as well. And then two white Caucasian families just like us. And then some more from China and India, and all the way around the circle it went. And there were 34 children. Somebody counted up the children one evening on a sunny day, like the United Nations playground out in the cul-de-sac is what it was. And many, many neighborhoods are like that. And the neighborhood we're living in right now is very much like that as well. We are living in a very multicultural country situation, and not every country in the world is like that, by the way. Canada is, the United States is a lot like that, a few other countries are, but many countries are not like that. But we definitely are that way. And here's the thing. These groups have brought their cultural and religious perspectives with them to our country as they've come. We all have done that. And see, the natural question that arises when all these folks get together in one area is, with all these other religious perspectives out there, who are you, North American Christian, to think that your views, especially your religious views, are the only right ones? They represent the only true way to come to God. Because the fact is, you're not the only game in town anymore, if you ever were. That's the kind of question that comes as a result. Now, when you add to that something we all know, I think, that in our culture we also place a high view on things like tolerance. Is that not correct? Very, very. We elevated that to a very high level, almost like our chief ethical virtue in Canada. And also relativism. And you take tolerance and relativism together, and they produce the idea that we should accept all views as roughly equal, especially when it comes to things like religion and ethics. And what we should refrain from doing is calling some views true and others false. To do that would just be arrogant and exclusionary, as we said before. Even more than that, a book came out in the 90s by an American philosopher. His name was Alan Bloom. Some of you have probably heard of the book. It was called The Closing of the American Mind. You might as well have called it The Closing of the North American Mind, or the Western Mind, because it really applies to the entire Western world. But it was really it really made a difference when that book came out. A lot of people began to pick up the book. And he argued in that book, Dr. Alan Bloom argued that the idea that you and I could have, well, he put it this way, he said, for the way many people in our culture think, the idea that you and I could have real objective truth is seen by huge numbers in our society as not simply a flawed and false hope. It's also actually considered to be a dangerous idea, the idea of objective, real truth. In other words, just the kind that says one thing is true, and the opposite is false. Objectively true and false. He says Dr. Bloom said, in the minds of many people, the whole idea that you can have real objective truth, it's out there and I can have some of it, is considered dangerous. And you say, well, why? What's dangerous about it? Well, Dr. Bloom said, because in the minds of many people, that is what leads people to say things like, I'm right. Which means if you disagree with me, what are you? You're wrong. I'm right and you must be wrong because we disagree. And Bloom said, in the minds of many people, that's what causes problems in our world. Some of the big problems like war and bigotry and racism and imperialism and imposing our worldview and perspectives on other people. This idea that one person can be right and somebody else can be wrong. And if we disagree, it's not just that we disagree. It's not disagreement only, but I'm right, which means you're wrong. And Bloom says, so the new goal for many people in our society is not to search for truth, not to figure out where the truth really is, but it's to get rid of the whole idea of truth altogether, and just to speak of perspective rather than truth, and to exalt tolerance as a new ultimate virtue, the virtue by which everything else is measured and judged. Now, if Bloom's right about that, just put that all together now. Here we are in a situation, multiple cultures all existing in one area, various ideas and perspectives on religion and faith, tolerance, the ultimate moral virtue, truth considered to be a dangerous thing. Put that all together, and along comes the Christian, the historic Christian, still contending for the faith once for all delivered to the saints, as it says in Jude, verse 3. And that Christian comes along and says, by the way, folks, I got a verse for you. Here it is, John 14:6, from Jesus. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And those sound like fighting words to people, don't they, in a culture like that? Or another one from the disciples, Acts 4:12. There is no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. Or 1 Timothy 2:5, the Apostle Paul. There's one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus. You have all these verses in there. And when you read through the New Testament, it really is hard to see the New Testament envisioning any other way for people to come to God than through Jesus. That's the story of the New Testament. But it's not hard to see why these are fighting words in a culture like ours. Hard truths in a very pluralistic society. Well, I'll tell you what we'll do first of all here tonight. Let's look at the journey of one very well-known religious pluralist. His name is John Hick. How many have heard the name John Hick before? He's a name that probably not as many will have heard of. I see a few hands going up here. Joe, I'm glad your hand went up on that. John Hick. Well, you know what? Interestingly enough, not as many will have heard John Hick's name, but John Hick will have influenced us in more ways than we'll know. His ideas, his thoughts have trickled down through a society in a huge, influential manner. So he really is a person for us to think about. He was born in 1922. He died just 3 years ago, in February of 2012. But let's think a little bit about John Hick and who the kind of person he was here. Let's talk a little bit about him, because he is a very well-known person who advocated religious pluralism in very, very fascinating ways and really important ways for us to understand. But his name is John Harwood Hick. As I say, born in 1922. He grew up in the Anglican tradition. At age 19, he became involved in his InterVarsity Fellowship group at the University College of Hull. He studied the New Testament. And he came to a point of conversion toward Christianity, to Christianity on the top of a double-decker bus, just like we have the picture of it up there. It says he experienced something very profound on the top of that bus. Here's what he says happened. Let me read you a quote from John Hick. He said, I was riding in that bus, thinking about my eternity and my future. He says, it was as though the skies opened up. They filled me with a sense of overflowing joy. He says, I couldn't help but smiling broadly, smiling back as it were at God. Though if any of the passengers were looking, they must have thought I was a lunatic, grinning at nothing up on top of the bus. That's what happened to him. Really, really a traumatic experience that happened to John Hick on the top of that bus. It sounded like a genuine conversion to Christianity. It sounded like he really met Jesus that day. That's what it sounds like. Well, he went on and embraced, as he said, the entire evangelical package of Christianity. That's a quotation from him. Then he went to study philosophy at Edinburgh. He joined the Presbyterian Church of England, became heavily involved in Bible studies and evangelist activities. Everything looked great. So far, so good. If you're from a Christian perspective looking at that, you say, well, that's a wonderful thing. And then his thinking began to change bit by bit. During his studies, he began to study under a philosopher named Norman Kemp Smith, who was a Kantian scholar. If you've studied Immanuel Kant, you'll begin to see what Immanuel Kant taught, and some things John Hick began to apply to religion and to Christianity. And his whole thinking about Christianity began to change. And the first thing that happened is, he says, he became increasingly distressed at what he called the narrowness and lack of sympathy with questioning thought among his fellow Christian students. You've seen people like that. They're in university, and they don't really ask many questions at all. They just want to get through. So they're Christians, and the professor's saying some things that maybe they don't agree with, but they just keep their head down, don't say a word. And John Hick wasn't that kind of guy. He wanted to ask questions. He wanted to interact. He said, why aren't you guys asking more questions? Well, they weren't. And he said that bothered him. And then he continued to think more. And he began to move further and further away from Christian orthodoxy. And eventually he began to reject things like the incarnation of Christ. In other words, the idea that Jesus was fully God and fully man, was God revealed in human form. He rejected that idea eventually. Then he began to reject the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. So now Jesus, being a mere man, never rose from the dead either. And by the time 1967 came along, he became a professor of theology at the University of Birmingham, and his identification with Orthodox Christianity came to a complete end. He cut ties with it. He said, well, here's what happened to me. These are his words in a moment here. But while attending worship in mosques, in synagogues, in temples, he says, I began to believe this, in his words. The same kind of thinking was taking place in all these other worship places, mosques, synagogues, and temples, as was taking place in a Christian church. Namely what? Human beings were opening their minds to a higher divine reality. He says, I began to see it happening in the mosque. I saw it happening in the temple, some of the other religious gatherings, and it looked to me like it was happening in a Christian church as well. No matter where it went, it looked to me like that's what's going on. And he thought more about that as this happened to him. And eventually he said, the idea that there could be just one true religion that presented a great conflict in his mind with the belief in God's universal saving activity. In other words, if God is saving people around the world, how could there be just one true religion? Hick said, I couldn't put those two together. And eventually he became convinced that no one religion has a monopoly on truth. All religions are simply human attempts to understand ultimate reality. Back behind whatever gods we worship here. And eventually he became an outspoken and highly respected proponent of religious pluralism. Well, this really is a view, as through all Hick's writings down through the years, that has trickled down and influenced many, many people in the Western world. So the question is it really very important what happened? Well, let's think about some implications for a moment here. I think that the implications are actually quite huge. The first is this. If religious pluralism is true, then of course this is true, isn't it? Christianity is not unique anymore. It simply is not. It has no special place in God's saving plan. It may be okay, maybe one of God's ways of bringing people to know himself, but it certainly is not unique, that's for sure. How about something we call evangelism? Going to knock on people's doors or going to make friends with people so we can invite them to come into the kingdom of God. How about that? Is there any place for that? No. It's unnecessary, but maybe not even just unnecessary. Maybe it's just arrogant. Because what does evangelism assume? Evangelism assumes people need to hear this message so they can come to know God. But if religious pluralism is true, it's at least unnecessary and maybe even arrogant to think they need our message for them to come to know God. So the implications of this are really huge, are really strong. So let's think a little bit about this. What exactly does religious pluralism teach? Okay, what does it teach? Let's look at that tonight here. And well, there we have these implications again. Christianity not unique. This is without all the pictures. Evangelism unnecessary, even arrogant. Okay, so what does it teach? Well, these are what we'll call John Hick's views, because of course there may be other people who will call themselves religious pluralists who don't teach exactly the same thing as John Hick, but he's a very well-known proponent. So we'll look at John Hick's views here because he's a very thoughtful proponent of religious pluralism. So let's just get his views on the table. Look at the first one. Religions are not all identical. Now, I want to make this point because sometimes you talk to people and you get the impression from them that they think that religions are all basically the same. Have you heard that before? I hear people say that fairly often. Aren't they basically saying the same thing? And of course, that comes from emphasizing some of the similarities, like most religions believe in God. Some strains of Buddhism don't, and there have been religions through history that didn't, but most people do. And most religious people have an ethical system, and they actually seem to be quite similar, and if you don't go too deep. And so there seem to be these similarities. But the fact is, there are great differences between the teachings of the various religions, and John Hick recognized that. For example, how about this? The human problem. If I were to ask you, what is the real big, basic human problem, let's say according to Buddhism, what is it? You know what the word would be? Desire. So if you look at what we call the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, they'll help you with some instructions and some advice for how to tame desires. Maybe even, not maybe eliminate them, but bring them way, way down so you can be content with what you have. Desire is the basic human problem according to Buddhism. How about according to Hinduism? The big basic problem according to Hinduism, what is it? Ignorance. So what do you need as far as Hinduism is concerned? What do we need to solve that? We need enlightenment. How about Christianity? What's the real human problem according to Christianity? Sin. Rebellion against God. These are very different answers, aren't they? One says desire, one says ignorance, one says sin, a rebellion against a holy God. Very different answers. And John Hick knew that. What if I ask this question? How does one attain salvation, or sometimes called liberation, according to the various religions of the world? Well, there's really two big answers here. Number one is through some kind of human effort, right? Whether it be depriving yourself of something, maybe some kind of asceticism, that's a word we often use for that, to deprive yourself, or maybe just doing good deeds. Okay, whether it be helping the poor, or fasting, or praying, or proselytizing. Through human effort, widely taught among the religions of the world. How about if you come to Christianity and say, how do you find salvation? How do you find salvation through Christianity? You know what the answer is? God's grace in Jesus. That's a very different answer than human effort. And John Hick knew these are different answers. One other one. Who is God in the first place? Or what we might call the most ultimate reality. Well, according to Christianity, there's a personal God up there, a real person who speaks, who loves, who desires, who acts. According to most Eastern religions, it's some kind of impersonal reality. Very different conception of who God, or most ultimate reality, is. And even if you say, well, let's go with a personal theistic kind of God, you've still got differences. According to Christianity, there's a Trinitarian God. There's a Father who is fully God. There's a Son who's fully God. There's a Spirit who's fully God. Talk to a Muslim about that. Talk to a Jewish person about that. And then they will reject the idea of a Trinity. It's a Unitarian God. And the point is, these are very different teachings, and I just want to make it real clear that John Hick recognized this. And John Hick was not asserting that all religions are the same, and it's really important that we see that as well. So to go to John Hick and just say, can't he see that religions are teaching something different? They can't all be pointing toward the same God because they teach things different. John Hick knew that. He had a much more sophisticated kind of response than that, because he understood full well the religions of the world are not identical. They teach different things. So let's go to number two for now. What did he teach secondly here? Well, look what he said about religions. All religions point to the same ultimate, transcendent reality. Okay, all of them do. Now, in other words, whether you're worshiping Jehovah, whether you're worshiping the Trinity, whether you're worshiping Allah or Krishna, whatever it may be. You know what the bottom line is according to John Hick? It's the same ultimate reality that you're ultimately worshiping, even though it will be perceived differently. You see what I'm saying? So, as a Christian, you're worshiping one divine being. A Jew, a different one. A Muslim, a different one. Maybe a Hindu, a different one. But you know what John Hick's saying? Behind all of that, there is the same ultimate reality. And his point was this, what he sometimes called the real. If we can have that word in mind, it's a really odd word, but think about this, the real. John Hick said the real is experienced differently by different people around the world through the various gods that they worship. And to add to that, he said, these manifestations of the ultimate reality, they're not illusory. They are real and authentic manifestations of the real. So there's this thing called the real back there, or the ultimate reality. It's an odd way for us to think of it, but this is a term that he came up with. He said that's what's back behind all these other divine beings. So whatever divine being you're worshiping, you're ultimately worshiping this ultimate reality through the divine being that you're worshiping. These are all different manifestations of this one being way back behind everything, called the ultimate reality. So what did this mean for John Hick? Well, in 1972, John Hick called for what he called a Copernican revolution in theology. He said Christians should no longer be holding as absolute truth that salvation is through Christ alone. We need to shift here. We need to recognize that all the religions of the world are like planets that circle around the one true absolute truth. There's one true absolute truth in the middle. That's ultimate reality. All the religions of the world are like planets circling around. That's why he called it a Copernican revolution. He says, and each one points toward ultimate reality. Nobody has a perfect understanding of it, but they all point toward that same ultimate reality. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but keep that view in mind because it's a really key one for us to have in mind if we can. Number 3 here. Let's talk about religions for a moment. He said all religions are limited, inadequate attempts to know this ultimate reality. That's what religions are. They're human constructions, human inventions. They're all made by different groups of humans around the world. And there are attempts to try to understand this ultimate reality. And furthermore, we could say it this way. The various world religions perceive ultimate reality differently, of course. As in one religion, they'll call it the Trinity. Another one, it'll be a Unitarian God. Another time, it'll be Allah. Another time, it'll be Krishna. The different perceptions. But you know why we perceive the ultimate reality differently? That's only because our perception of God is not identical with ultimate reality as it really is in itself. It actually transcends human experience. So that's what religions are. They simply are attempts to understand ultimate reality the very best we can. Number 4. How about this one here? The salvation is available through all the world religions. This is really key for John Hick. It doesn't matter what the world religion is, salvation is available through all, and they all produce morally upright people. So you can find the Dalai Lama, find Mahatma Gandhi. These are saints from a non-Christian religious tradition. They display the same kind of virtues commended by Christianity. We should put them in the same category as a Mother Teresa or anybody else, a Billy Graham or whoever, because that's exactly what they are. And these are the really 3 big basic ideas here. 4 basic ideas about religious pluralism. Now, the question is, how do you respond to all this? How do we think about all these ideas? What is the best way to think about this? Well, let me just start in with a number of comments, and there'll be time for interaction later on, and that's, as Joe said, and that's really important for us to have a bit later on. But how do we respond? Well, I think we should remember 3 facts first off. Because when we start thinking about other religions, and we're in a very sensitive area here, and people feel very strongly about this in very different ways. What do we say here? Three important facts for us to think about. And the first one is just this. The non-Christian religions, and I'm saying this as a Christian here today, non-Christian religions are not wholly false. See what I'm saying? They're not completely, entirely false. Now, this isn't really any kind of a profound insight here. Probably a reminder of what most of us know. But even if you look at another religion in the world and say, no, that religion, I don't think that's a true religion. Well, I had a professor a long time ago that held up a book that he really disagreed with, a big book. He said, you know what? I disagree with this book. But does that mean there's not some things in the book that are true? No, he said, you can't write hundreds of pages without saying some things that are true. Okay? So there's going to be some true things in there. And as the Scottish writer and pastor George MacDonald said, truth is truth, whether from the lips of Jesus or Balaam. So we are called to affirm truth and moral virtue wherever they are found. Wherever they are found. And here, I think, is how we should see it. The Christian should maintain that God's revelation in Jesus is true, that other religious systems are wrong, or they contradict Christian revelation and not anywhere else. C.S. Lewis even goes further and says, I would be very surprised if Christianity was the only religion in the world that said anything true. That would be a very surprising thing. So I think we should just remember, all we're saying as Christians there are some key basic truth claims that Christians present to the world. And where another system, whether it be a religious system or a philosophical system, disagrees and contradicts those, we have no choice but to say, yeah, I think they're mistaken at those points. But that's not the same thing as saying the non-Christian religion is completely and wholly false in every single thing it ever says. So that's the first fact I think we should remember. The second one is this. Let's keep this in mind. Christianity is not the only exclusivistic religion. Christians are sometimes, quite often in our culture, as we've already been saying here today, accused with having a very exclusivistic faith, saying Jesus is the way to come to God. It's really important to remember that any religious system of the world that puts forward truth claims is implying that the opposite of those truth claims is what? Is false. And so there's exclusivism. Anywhere there's a truth claim made, there's exclusivism. And it's really important to remember Christianity, does it make truth claims? Yes, it does. Does that mean they're exclusivistic? Well, truth claims by nature are exclusivistic. And so, but that also means that other religions, when they make truth claims, also are making exclusivistic claims as well. And I think it's key that we remember that. The third one is this. Christians can cooperate with people of other faiths on certain issues. I think we have a real opportunity here, by the way. In other words, maybe we look across the way in our culture and we say, you know what, I feel very strongly about the issue of let's say abortion. Or I feel really strongly about the issue of religious liberty in our culture. I see people here who are in an entirely different religious tradition than I am. But they feel the same as I do on those issues. Why can't we work together on those issues? Yeah, I think we can. And we do. And you see that happening from time to time. And I actually think it's a good way to build bridges with people who are different in other ways. So, in other words, you can do that without compromising anything of Christian uniqueness when that happens. You can build bridges and work together with people who have those differences. No, that's the first point I'd like to remember. Just remember those three facts. Here's the second one. Let's acknowledge something. If you're a Christian here today, we might as well acknowledge something that is undeniable, and why would we want to deny it anyway? And that is this, that Christian teaching here, that Christianity does have a very deeply exclusive element to it. If we don't like that word, we need to find some other word for it. But the point is, the Scripture both teaches and assumes throughout that Jesus is the way to come to God. We've already seen a little bit of that. But John 14:6, as we read before, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. It's an unavoidable statement right there. If Jesus said it, that's really unavoidable, and he is our founder. He's making that statement. Acts 4:12, there is no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. I read 1 Timothy 2:5 before that. How about this? Romans chapter 10. If you confess with your mouth Jesus and believe in your heart God raised him from the dead, you shall be saved. These are all statements in the New Testament. It's really quite clear where the New Testament's coming from on this issue. That it envisions no other way for people to come to God than through Jesus, which means that's our message. That's the message we have to communicate to the world, is the message of Jesus. But that causes a problem for some people. That exclusivism is very difficult to take. And here's the third point I want to make here. Number 3. The objection concerning this is actually a self-defeating objection. Let's think about what that means. In other words, to object to this exclusivism of Christianity is self-defeating in its very nature. In other words, to say this as an objection, to say Christianity is exclusive, and I find that to be wrong, I find that to be arrogant, and find that to be intolerant, I cannot accept that. That's self-defeating. Why is that self-defeating? Well, this would actually be a great place to have a little group discussion and figure this one out together. But here, let me just put it this way. Let me put this as crassly as I can. Just think about this question with me. Is it wrong? Is it exclusive? Is it intolerant for someone to come along and say, you know what? My view about the way a person comes to God is different than your view, isn't it? And I believe my view is correct, and I believe your view is not. How about that? Is that an exclusive kind of statement? Let me say it again. You and I disagree on this. I have a view about how a person comes to God. It's different than your view, isn't it? You have a view, and our views are different. I believe my view is correct, and I believe yours is not. Is that an exclusive kind of statement? Yeah, it is, isn't it? You know why? Because it really, truly does assert that one idea is correct, and it excludes the opposite idea from being correct. That's just what it does. Now, the more important question is, okay, is that also intolerant? Is that wrong? Is that bad to make a statement like that? Well, if it is exclusive and if it is wrong, then here's the point. The person who objects to Christian exclusivism is also exclusive, isn't he? Or she. How? Well, notice what that person is saying. That person comes to the Christian and says this to the Christian. Your view as a Christian is that Jesus is the only way to come to God, right? My view is that there are other ways to come to God. And here's the kicker. I believe my view is correct and your view is not. You follow me there? That's what's going on here. And so you can't really avoid the exclusivism either way. It is impossible to avoid when you make any assertions at all. When you make any kind of a significant assertion at all, you're implying that the opposite is false. And I think that's a really key idea. So in other words, when someone comes and says, you know what I don't like about Christianity is that it makes those exclusive truth claims. Well, we just need to understand, are you saying you disagree with this claim? Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Well, that means you're excluding it from being true as well. And in other words, in the very act of saying I disagree with it, I'm excluding it, and you'd be equally exclusive. And that's the point. You can't really make any statement at all, can you, without being exclusive? What if I come into the room today and I say, you know what, the lights are on? Okay? And you say, wow, Chamberlain, you're kind of arrogant to make a statement like that. I say, why? What did I say here? Well, you have just excluded anybody who thinks the lights are off from being true. And I guess I did, didn't I? I didn't mean to be exclusive in any kind of a bad way, but when I make a statement the lights are on, I'm implying that for someone to say the lights are off is wrong. When I say there's people in this room, and I'm implying that if anyone said there's not people in this room, is wrong. When I say there are many ways to come to God, I'm implying that anyone who says there is not many ways to come to God is wrong. When I say there's one way, I'm implying that a person who says there's more than one way is wrong. You can't make statements without having the opposite being assumed to be implied to be false. And that's the problem right there. And I would just say to a person who says, you know, that's a kind of exclusivism, that's what I don't like. Well, you know what? That kind of exclusivism is actually unavoidable. And I would just say, you know what's really more important here? Let's get past that, because we're both making exclusive truth claims here. You know what the real question is? How does a person come to God? That's the real key question. Because no matter how it is, it's going to end up implying that the opposite is false. Anyway, let's leave that one. We can talk more about that in the question time if we need to. Number 4. Here is an interesting implication of pluralism that maybe we don't see right off the bat. Notice the pluralist is attempting to be an inclusive type of situation, isn't it? Well, John Hicks says that the exclusivity of Christianity is what he is trying to move away from. What do we have in its place? An inclusive religious pluralism. Well, look what we have up here. Religious pluralists end up distorting the teachings of all the world religions to make them fit into the pluralistic framework. And in the process, become what? Highly exclusivistic themselves. How does that happen? What do we mean by this? Well, notice what John Hick has told Christians for the last 50 years of his life as he was teaching away here. He said, you know, for Christians, what I need to tell you folks is this, that Jesus Christ is not the revelation of God in human form. He is not fully God and fully man. In fact, Jesus was wholly human. And in fact, whenever you see self-sacrificing love lived out in response to God, as you saw in Jesus, that's when we see divine love being incarnate, becoming incarnate on earth. That's the incarnation. It's the only incarnation we're ever going to get. That's John Hick's message to Christians, right? Now, my question for you is this. What is John Hick doing? Is he allowing Christianity to stand on its own teachings when he makes a statement like that? No, he's not, is he? He's actually telling Christians what they really should believe. And in the process denying some of the key doctrines of Christian faith. Why? So you can take off the sharp edge of its exclusivity, make it fit into a pluralistic, inclusive framework. And the point is, he's done this with all the world religions in one fell swoop. None of them are allowed to stand on their own teachings. All have been pushed into an inclusive framework, they're all being told that it's wrong to declare the teachings of other religions false. Their own distinctive teachings have been ruled out. Now, this is a pretty important implication here, because what does this all come down to? And this is why I see this as being so significant. The pluralist is not allowing any of the religions of the world to stand on their own teachings. In effect, the pluralist is setting up a brand new religion, if you will. What I might call an inclusivistic one that says all the present ones with their own distinctive teachings are all wrong. But notice what that means. You're telling the world that if you don't believe this version of religion, then you have it wrong. And that's about as exclusivistic as you can get, which I guess is okay, unless you've just spent the last 30 or 40 years telling us that no one should make exclusivistic kinds of claims. You see what I'm saying here? And that's the point that was going on, that I find that it's a really kind of a full circle idea here. The pluralist starts out by saying, I want an inclusive religion. ends up by saying, and all the other religions need to change so they can fit into this inclusive pluralistic framework. In the process, saying the only one that's really right is this particular new way of thinking about religion, and it becomes as exclusive as the ones we had before. Let's look at this way. Some of us have probably heard the story of the blind man from Benares touching the elephant before the king. How many have heard this story? It's a really well known. So 4 blind men touching the elephant. It's a really famous story. And they're doing this before the king. One touches a leg and thinks it's anybody remember this? It's a tree, exactly. One touches a trunk and thinks he's got a snake in his hand. Okay? One touches a tail, thinks he's got a rope in his hand. And the king is looking on and says, these blind men, they're like followers or worshipers, adherents of the various religions of the world. People who are religious all have some different experience or some perception of God or ultimate reality, but it's all really the same God, the same ultimate reality. And this is how John Hick used it. In other words, we're all finite, we're all limited, we have some truth, but no, we don't have it all. And just like those people touching the elephant, we should realize that we're all actually touching the same elephant, so therefore we should respect the experiences and perceptions of other religions as well, because you know what? They're experiencing the same ultimate reality as we are, even though differently. Okay, because they're all touching the same elephant, all touching the same ultimate reality. Well, you know what? Think a little bit about that analogy, and maybe some of you have already. Using that analogy, where has John Hick placed himself? You thought about that? He's in a pretty advantageous position, isn't he? Remember, the rest of us as religious people are all down there pulling on a trunk or a leg. We have some truth, some inadequate, some incomplete truth. Whereas Hick, he's standing back, claiming to have the correct vantage point. He's above us all, looking from beyond the rest who have half-truths, partial truths. He has the truth. He has the whole thing figured out. Everybody else is wrong, and he's got the full truth there. Now, I would just say again, in the name of inclusivism, this gets to be about as exclusivistic as you could get. And that's the full circle thing that's happened here. You start with inclusivism and end up with something really exclusive, which, as I was to say again, there's nothing wrong with doing that, nothing wrong with claiming to know or declare truth on religious matters in an exclusive way, unless you've just spent the last 30 or 40 years telling people nobody should do that. And that's what's happened with religious pluralism this way. Let me go on to a fifth point here. And that is this one here. This one I found to be a really interesting one when I looked into this a number of years back. And that is this. The fact that yours and my beliefs in the world, beliefs in life, are influenced by our circumstances in life does not mean those beliefs are wrong or right for that matter, or the religious pluralism is true. Let me just ask you the question. Would you agree with me that the beliefs we have are influenced by our circumstances in life, where we are born, where we are raised? Would we all agree with that? I think we probably would, okay? So what are we saying here with this point? The fact that is true, the fact that our beliefs in life are influenced by our circumstances in life, does not mean those beliefs are wrong, or right for that matter, or that religious pluralism is true. What are we saying here? What are we getting at? Well, John Hick made a huge big deal of this fact, that as he said, put it, that one's religious beliefs are the result of where and when one was born and where one lives. He made a huge deal, and here's how he put it. And I'll give you a quote from his, or one of his books. He said this: "If I had been born in India, I would probably be a Hindu. If I had been born in Egypt, I'd probably be a Muslim. If I had been born in Sri Lanka, I'd probably be a Buddhist. But I was born in England," he said, in 1922, "and am predictably a Christian." Okay? Making quite a big point of this, and he always did. And he went on to say, his point is this, that we don't believe our faith because it's true, or because we've carefully examined it, or we've come to the conclusion that we really should believe it. You know why we believe the faith that we do? Simply because that's how and where we were raised. And if we've been raised in a different time, a different place, we probably believe something different. Which, of course, should cause us to view other religions on the same equal footing as us. We should recognize that we could be in any one of them if our circumstances had been different. We believe that religion just as we believe the one we do now today. We belong to that one, and therefore we should have the same kind of respect for that one, because we could be there if we happen to be born over there, and that would be just fine. Well, how do we respond to this kind of thing? What about that? Well, let me give three responses here, and the first one is this. I think that Hick is probably right about the basic facts. At least as I think about this, that the more people are raised in Hindu environments, the more they become Hindu. More people raised in Christian environments become Christian, and so on. That seems to be quite right. Okay, but how about that? What follows from that? I would say this, that says nothing about the truth or the falsehood of the various religions of the world. In other words, a person may have good reason for believing the teachings he or she has been taught. They may have good reason to switch or to convert from those. But the fact that you and I have been raised in a certain environment does not mean those teachings that we've been taught are false or questionable or anything else. In other words, none of this shows pluralism to be true. Let me give a little illustration from politics. Suppose we meet a young man, and he's really involved, a young person, really involved in politics. Maybe the person is a conservative, or maybe a member of the Liberal Party, BC or Canada, whatever, really involved in, and just has a real heart for politics, really loves politics, okay? And suppose you go up to that person one day and you say, you know what? If you'd been raised in Nazi Germany back in the 30s, I'll bet you would have been a member of the Hitler Youth. Suppose you say that to the person, okay? How do you think that person might respond? Well, I would say this. The person might actually agree with you and then ask what your point is. What is the point of that? What follows from that? What does this fact mean? Does it mean that the person should maybe not now be a conservative? Or should not now be a member of the Liberal Party? Does it mean the person should now try to join some Nazi youth group? Because that's what they would have been if they would have been born in Germany in the 30s. Does that mean there's no correct political ideology? Does it mean we should all be political pluralists, if there is such a thing? Kind of my term here, I think. You know what? It doesn't seem to me that it means much at all. And in the same way, to tell someone if they had been raised in different circumstances, they would now believe something different, even if that were true, I think it tells us nothing about the truth of what that person now believes or what they should believe. You see what I'm saying? I don't see how it relates and has much to say about the truth at all. Let me give one more little response on this. This one comes from philosopher Alvin Plantinga. Some of you may know his name. He says, Alvin Plantinga says, let's take that same reasoning that John Hick used and apply it back to the pluralist himself. Remember the reasoning? The reasoning was, if I had been born in a different time or place, I believe that religion or that set of ideas, just like I believe these ones here. Therefore, I should probably have a lot of respect for those ideas as well. Alvin Plantinga says, let's think about this. Let's apply this back to the pluralists' pluralism and ask what would happen to his pluralism if we actually applied it back. And then Plantinga says this, pluralism is not and has not been widely popular in the world at large. It seems to be fairly commonplace in our culture right now. But if you go back far enough and go back around the world at large, it has not been that common. He says, and if the pluralist had been born in Madagascar or in medieval France, he probably wouldn't be a pluralist. Now, does it follow from that he should not now be a pluralist? And Plantinga asked. And I think that's not a bad question to ask a pluralist. And of course, the pluralist will probably say, well, no, it doesn't. And I'd say, well, if that's the case, if it doesn't work against pluralism, then I don't see how it works against anything else either. Of course, if it does work against pluralism, then it would crumble, and we could just ignore it at that point. But I think that's not a bad question to ask at that point. Let me go to number 6 here. A sixth comment by way of responding, and something that is a little bit more broader question here about religious pluralism. I think we need to think about this word tolerance, and not just for this topic, but for in general, we need to think about this topic and to carefully define this term. We mentioned earlier that this is a really key term in our culture, a really key value. In fact, some people think it may be as I said earlier, maybe our chief ethical virtue in Canada right about now. I mean, if you violate the tolerance, the cardinal rule of tolerance, you can be marginalized pretty quickly in Canadian society. I mean, it really, really is a very strong value. But what does it mean to be tolerant? And the reason that's applicable here is because when Christians come along and say there is one way to come to God through Jesus, often Christians are labeled as intolerant for having said that. Well, we need to define this term tolerance, because is it intolerant to make a statement like that? Well, what does it mean to be tolerant? Well, I think that it's commonly thought to mean that for me to be tolerant towards something is to mean that I agree with that thing, or I somehow maybe even endorse or affirm it. Is that not correct? Is that how you see the word tolerance used? In other words, you and I may well be seen as intolerant if we state our disagreement with a particular viewpoint or religious position or ethical viewpoint or lifestyle or whatever it may be. If we state our disagreement with it, we are quite liable to be called intolerant. Say, well, I guess you take an intolerant position toward that lifestyle or that viewpoint or that religious position or whatever. Who are you to be so intolerant of that group over there? Why? Because we state our disagreement with it. The point being that the way to be tolerant would be to agree with it, to affirm it. Is that a correct usage of the word tolerance? I think there's a real error, a real mistake there. What if I was to say this to you? That tolerance actually entails disagreement. Is that correct? What do you think about that? To be tolerant, it actually entails disagreement. Why? Well, think about it this way. If I agree with you, do I need to tolerate you? Do I need to tolerate what you just said if I agree with you? No, I don't. I already agree with it. And to think of tolerating something I already agree with means that now we're talking in language that doesn't really make much sense anymore. See, tolerance seems to me to be an attitude, if we go back and just interpret the word in a very sane and normal, traditional way. Tolerance is an attitude that says, I disagree with something you're doing or you're saying, but I will respect or at least accept your right to do it and say it. That's what tolerance is all about. It starts with a disagreement of something you're doing or saying, but says, I will accept your right to say and do it. And the point is that tolerance actually requires pretty strong views, pretty strong convictions, so that you actually end up disagreeing with this or with that. And then it's an attitude that says, okay, I do disagree with it, but I will accept your right to say or do it anyway. That's what tolerance is. And of course, we know that we shouldn't tolerate everything. All of us know in our society know that. We even see bumper stickers that say zero tolerance towards certain things. You've probably seen some of those billboards and bumper stickers, zero tolerance toward, and you can fill in the blank there. But when it comes to matters of faith and religion, it seems to me, as a Christian, that we as Christians ought to be leading the way here. Our message ought to be to people around us, yes, actually, we do disagree. If you think there's other ways to come to God, yeah, we disagree on that. But let's talk. Let's be gracious. Let's be respectful. Let's speak the truth in love, which assumes there is truth on the matter. We're going to seek it, and we're going to speak it. And that's, I think, the true tolerant attitude. And it seems to me as Christians, we have an opportunity here to lead the way. Let me give just one more comment here by way of response, and that is this. When it comes to thinking about the issue of religious pluralism, I think we need to be ready with reasons for one key thing, and that is Jesus' uniqueness. Have some reasons ready for thinking Jesus' astounding claims actually make sense. Think of how astounding the claim is. I am the way, the truth, and the life. If I said that, what would you think? If your minister, the Reverend Joe, said that, what would you think? And no matter who you talk, what other human being, you say, that guy has either really had a bad day, he's lost it, something is wrong, or if he really believes it, it's way worse than even that. But here's Jesus saying that, and we're taking him seriously. How can you take somebody seriously when they make a statement like that? That statement is so far over the top that if it's actually true, we've got a really unique person on our hands. If it's not true, the person who, as C.S. Lewis said, his I think, how did he put it? His arrogance is unrivaled. His silliness and arrogance is unrivaled by anybody else in history. Okay? That's the kind of person we're talking about here. Now, if Jesus made those kinds of statements, and Christians believe those, there's one reason for that. And that is because Christians believe Jesus to be unique. Unique, I mean in a strong sense of the term. We often will talk about something being quite unique. That's actually not the proper way to use the word, is it? Or very unique. It's a little bit like being quite pregnant, very pregnant. You either are or you're not, okay? And with unique, you either are or you're not, because unique means one of a kind. So you can't really be quite one of a kind. You either are or you are not. Christians have had the idea for 2,000 years, based on what the things Jesus said and did, that he is absolutely unique. He is divine and human. Who else is like that? He died for the sins of the world. He rose again. He taught wonderful ethical teachings and then lived them out in every detail. Who else ever did that? Okay? And so I would just say this. These things all made Jesus unique. And unique people can make unique claims. Unique people are warranted in making unique claims. If Jesus was unique, it makes sense for him to make unique claims. And I would say if we are going to be talking about religious pluralism from the Christian standpoint, speaking of Jesus as being the one who made these claims, we need to give people some reason for thinking he really was as unique as we believe him to be. Because if he was, these statements all make sense. If he wasn't, we would just write him off like we write anybody else off who make a statement like that. Unique people can make unique claims. Thanks very much.